In the summer of 1348, London was about to experience something so horrific, so absolute in its destruction, that those who survived would never be the same. Bodies would pile up in the streets. The living would envy the dead. This is the story of London during the Black Death, the darkest chapter in the city's history. Before the plague arrived, London was a thriving medieval metropolis of nearly 80,000 people. The year was 1348, and England's capital was bursting at the seams. Timber-framed houses leaned over narrow, winding streets. The Thames was thick with boats bringing goods from across Europe. Markets overflowed with fish, bread, and wool. Church bells rang out every hour, marking the rhythm of daily life. But London had a problem. It was filthy, desperately, unbearably filthy. There was no sewage system. Human waste was simply thrown into the streets or dumped into the river. Butchers discarded animal guts onto the cobblestones. The stench was overpowering. Rats were everywhere, in the walls, in the rafters, in the food stores. Nobody thought much of them. They were just part of city life. The city was packed tight. Families of 8 or 10 crammed into single rooms. The poor slept on straw mattresses crawling with fleas. The wealthy had larger homes, but even they shared their spaces with servants, animals, and vermin. London was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in early autumn 1348, aboard trading ships from mainland Europe. Sailors stumbled off the docks at the port of London, already dying. Some had enormous black swellings, buboes bulging from their necks, armpits and groins. Others coughed up blood. Within hours of docking, several were dead. Nobody understood what was happening. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or infection. Doctors believed disease was caused by bad air or an imbalance of bodily humors. Some blamed the alignment of the planets. Others saw it as God's punishment for sin. All of them were wrong. The disease that had arrived was Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, carried by fleas on black rats. And in London's cramped, rat-infested conditions, it spread like wildfire. At first, just a handful of people fell ill. Within a week, dozens were sick. Within 2 weeks, hundreds. The disease moved through London's poorest neighbourhoods, first the overcrowded slums south of the Thames, the packed tenements near the docks. People woke up feeling fine and were dead by nightfall. Others lingered for days in unspeakable agony. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed fever, chills, and crushing headaches. Then came the buboes, swellings the size of eggs or apples. The lymph nodes literally exploded under the skin. The buboes appeared black or purple, giving the plague its name, the Black Death. The pain was excruciating. Victims screamed until their voices gave out. Some developed a different form, pneumonic plague, where the infection moved to the lungs. These victims coughed up blood and black phlegm. Every breath was torture. They could spread the disease simply by coughing. And they died even faster, usually within 48 hours. By November 1348, London was in crisis. The death toll doubled every few days. The living could barely keep up with burying the dead. As the plague tightened its grip, London began to fall apart. Normal life became impossible. Markets closed as vendors fled or died. Bakeries shut down. The food supply collapsed. Those who still had money couldn't find anything to buy. Those without money simply starved alongside the plague victims. The streets became hellscapes. Bodies lay where they fell, in doorways, in alleys, in the middle of roads. There weren't enough people left to collect them all. The stench of death hung over the city like fog. Families who lost loved ones couldn't afford proper burials. They wrapped bodies in sheets and left them on street corners, hoping someone would take them away. The church tried to maintain order. Priests went door to door, administering last rites to the dying. But the priests were dying too. In some parishes, Every single clergyman died within weeks. Churches stood empty, their bells silent. Without priests, there were no masses, no confessions, no burials. The spiritual fabric of medieval life unraveled. Desperation bred superstition. People believed the plague was spread by poisoned air, so they carried bunches of flowers to sniff, hence the nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," with its line, "Pocket full of posies." Others thought bathing opened the pores and let plague in, so they stopped washing entirely, making conditions even worse. Some turned to flagellation, whipping themselves bloody in public processions, believing their suffering would appease God's wrath. Groups of flagellants marched through London's streets, their backs shredded to ribbons, chanting prayers and psalms. It did nothing to stop the plague. The city's infrastructure collapsed, the legal system shut down, courts closed, trials stopped, crime exploded, looters broke into homes where entire families had died, stealing whatever they could carry. There was no one left to stop them, no one to maintain law and order. By December, London's population was in free fall. An estimated 200 people were dying every single day. The city couldn't dig graves fast enough. The traditional churchyard burials became impossible. There simply wasn't room. The church opened mass burial pits outside the city walls. Bodies were stacked in layers, covered with thin layers of dirt. Then more bodies piled on top. Some pits held thousands of corpses. The plague didn't discriminate. Rich and poor, young and old, holy and sinful, all fell to the disease. The Archbishop of Canterbury died. The king's own daughter, Princess Joan, died while traveling to her wedding in Spain. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Whole families were erased from existence. But the poor suffered most. They lived in the most crowded conditions, had the least access to food, and couldn't flee the city like the wealthy. The rich packed up and left for country estates as soon as the plague arrived. The poor had nowhere to go. They died in droves. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents watched helplessly as their sons and daughters developed buboes and slipped into delirium. Some children were orphaned overnight when both parents died. With no family left, they wandered the streets, starving and terrified, until the plague took them too. The psychological horror was perhaps worse than the physical disease. Londoners lived in constant terror, never knowing if they would be next. Neighbors avoided neighbors. Friends abandoned friends. Some families, when one member showed symptoms, locked them in a room and left them to die alone, hoping to save the rest of the household. It rarely worked. Trust evaporated. People believed anyone could be a carrier. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled sick parents. The bonds of family and community, the foundations of medieval society, shattered under the weight of fear and death. There were stories, impossible to verify but widely believed, of people being buried alive. In the chaos and panic, plague victims who fell unconscious were sometimes thrown into burial pits before they were actually dead. Whether true or not, the stories added to the pervasive atmosphere of horror. By spring 1349, London looked like a ghost town. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Grass grew in the streets. Buildings fell into disrepair with no one left to maintain them. The city that had housed 80,000 people now held perhaps 40,000. And the dying continued. Then, gradually, it slowed. By summer 1349, the death rate began to decline. Not because anyone had found a cure, they hadn't. Not because doctors finally understood the disease, they didn't. The plague simply ran out of victims. It had killed everyone it was going to kill in London. For now, when the plague finally loosened its grip, Londoners emerged into a transformed world. Half the city was gone. Entire professions had been decimated. Some craft guilds lost every single member. Families that had lived in London for generations were extinct. But for those who survived, opportunities emerged from the ashes. With half the population dead, labor became incredibly valuable. Peasants and workers who had been barely surviving before the plague suddenly found themselves in demand. Wages doubled, then tripled. For the first time, common people had bargaining power. The old social order began to crack. Lords couldn't find enough workers for their estates. Craftsmen demanded higher pay and got it. The rigid feudal system that had governed England for centuries started to break down. Within a generation, it would lead to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. London slowly rebuilt. New people moved in from the countryside to fill the empty homes. Markets reopened, trade resumed. Life somehow went on. But the scars remained. The city built monuments and established hospitals in memory of the dead. Special prayers were added to church services. The trauma passed down through generations. The Black Death returned to London multiple times over the next few centuries, most notably in 1665, the Great Plague, but none matched the devastation of 1348. 1349. That first outbreak killed an estimated 40,000 Londoners in less than a year. Some estimates go even higher. Today, we walk through London on streets built over those medieval plague pits. We live in buildings constructed on lots where entire families died. The city survived as cities do, but it never forgot. The Black Death showed humanity at its worst, the panic, the abandonment, the collapse of civilization under pressure, but it also showed resilience. The survivors rebuilt, they adapted, they created a new world from the ruins of the old. This was London during the Black Death, not the romantic medieval city of legend, but a place of unimaginable horror and suffering. A reminder that civilization is fragile, that disease can shatter societies, and that our ancestors endured nightmares we can barely comprehend. Yet they endured, and so did London.